Thank you, Janaya, or Crystal. And first, I'd like to just thank NASI for extending this invitation to me. NASI was the first grantee that I met when I started at the Rockefeller Foundation. So it's kind of nice. Tomorrow's my last day at the Rockefeller Foundation, so it just feels like a full circle, kind of ending it off with NASI. My name is Monica SanMiguel, as Crystal said, and I am a research associate at the Rockefeller Foundation, which is different than the Rockefeller Center. I always get that question. So it's essentially, it's the oldest foundation in the United States that is dedicated to improving the lives and well-being of people in the developing world. And the foundation was founded in 1913, and so we've been around for a while. But I'll take the focus a little bit away from the history of the Rockefeller Foundation, and essentially I'm just here to tell you a little bit about my experience working on social insurance policy and hope to convey why what you've learned today is important and why the lessons that you've learned today really matter, if it hasn't already been made evident. I've been working at the Rockefeller Foundation for a little over 2 years, and a large portion of my work there has been focused on an initiative called the Campaign for American Workers. Essentially, this is a 7-year initiative, $70 million, that the foundation has dedicated to improving the economic security of low and moderate income workers. And the way we define economic security varies. Some experts, have a very broad definition of economic security, one that includes housing, income. We, bounded by our limited resources, have a definition that essentially, in very basic words, means an individual or family's ability to weather any short-term income interruptions. So a family's ability to make it through, if their car breaks down or their roof needs repairing, that won't lead them to economic disaster. And then the longer-term definition for us of economic security, let me put this down, is one in which every American should have the ability to save for retirement or an ability to retire adequately. And that means different things for different people. People who are, making $50,000 a year have access to a 401k. Our interest is in helping them get better, easier access to those plans to help them participate at higher levels. And then for those that are at the lower income spectrum, we're focusing much more on tax policy. How can tax credits incentivize saving? How can and strengthening, more than anything, strengthening Social Security, because for these income populations, Social Security is the cornerstone of their retirement security. The sad truth is that the social contract in this country is deteriorating, and it has been for some time. I don't know if you are all familiar with the jargon social contract, but in essence, it's the agreement between workers, employers, and government to provide a basic economic safety net for workers. I'm going to just share some data that I think is always it just blows my mind when I go back to it. 39% of working households are adequately saving for retirement. That means 60% of American households are currently not saving at the rates that they should be to prepare them for an adequate retirement. Women and minorities are particularly vulnerable to economic insecurity as they reach retirement, since they are less likely to work in jobs that provide them a vehicle to save for retirement, like a 401k. And B, they are less likely to participate even if they do have access to those. So even for those workers that do have 401k plans, as we've all seen in the news with the recent economic crash, 401k plans have lost about 40% of their value in the past year. So this is definitely an issue that has been, retirement security and economic security has been something that's been deteriorating for working Americans for the past 20, 30 years. But I think this is a really interesting time in our economic history, because it's something that's now creeping up the income ladder. So now people making $70,000, $80,000 a year are worried about their retirement, are worried about, am I going to rely on Social Security because my 401k savings are wiped out? I say all of this to illustrate to you that what you've learned today and what we're talking about here is not in the abstract. It's something that affects millions and millions of people. We're talking about the millions of people who rely on Social Security as their sole source of guaranteed income as they are unable to work. We're talking about the millions of children who rely on Social Security because their parents have passed away or their parents can't work to provide for them. We're talking about the millions of widows like my grandmother whose Social Security check is the only income she can count on. Just a little personal story. My grandfather came to the U.S. with his family over 40 years ago under a labor contract between Mexico and the U.S. And he worked as a farm worker for 30 years in fields all across the U.S. My grandmother never worked a day in her life because she was always taking care of the kids and then grandkids eventually. But when my grandfather passed away 5 years ago, my grandmother at the age of 66 could not even fathom beginning to get a job. No work experience, very limited English. And to her, her Social Security check benefits that she received is something that's so valuable to her. And thankfully, my grandfather worked here long enough that she has sufficient benefits to hold her through. I can go on and on with personal stories in my family, in my community, in Chicago, about how our current retirement system and our safety net is not enough to sustain many working families and many working Americans. To me, these stories are of people working hard in their long lives and not having enough to reach their basic economic security. And this is what drives me to pursue a degree in policy. All too often, policymakers and decision makers, and including folks at foundations, forget that we're talking about real people, real families that sit together at the end of the night at the kitchen table trying to figure out how to make ends meet. We get caught up in the research, the numbers and the proposals and the data, the legislation, and it's really easy to forget that human face. So if I could pass on some advice about how to progress in a career of policy or how to take this work forward, I just encourage you to think about the human face, and they should not be disconnected. And I know when I come to DC, I always get this very strong, my observations are that there is a disconnect between the inner circle, the beltway, the wonks, and the working Americans that are really facing these issues. The second thing that I just want to reiterate is that these are issues that our generation needs to take ownership over. They are not going to go away with the baby boomers. In fact, they are precipitated and exacerbated for our generation. And all too often we go to meetings and conferences where, the average age is 55 for the people discussing this. And I just encourage you to really think about how these issues affect you, your friends, your cousins, your friends on Facebook and Twitter. I mean, this is really an issue of our generation. There's a lot of research that shows that younger workers are less likely to have access to a 401k or pension plan. So just both keeping in mind the human face and claiming this as an issue of our generation is something that I would encourage all of you to think of as you leave here and leave DC and go back to your universities. So I'm happy to answer any questions about the foundation or my work. And yes, at the end, but thank you all.